Welcome back, everybody, for our third session of the day on the Gen Z stage, where we're going to be digging into one of the biggest buzzwords of the past year, diversity. There's plenty of research to support the notion that diverse teams are more likely to perform better and help increase profitability, but not everybody gets diversity strategies right. How can we create human-first workplaces that meaningfully champion diversity and inclusion in an authentic and effective way? To answer this question, we have a star lineup who will have no shortage of insight. And leading the way as our moderator is Aminka Belvitt, who is the founder and CEO of Wofemtech, a cloud-based video and audio conferencing platform, which you should all try after hopping. She believes when women and girls are empowered with the opportunity to innovate, they can create their own solutions for a more equitable world. Please do drop in your questions in the Q&A box throughout the session. Don't forget to do this. Over to you, Aminka.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're so excited for the conversation that we're going to have today. Thank you, Koji. Thank you, Young One World. And we will get it started. I will introduce our panelists for the conversation we will have this afternoon. Kristin, Duquette, former Obama administration and 5-time American record holder in Paralympic swimming, current One Young World ambassador, and Truman Project National Security Fellow. Welcome, Kristin. And we also have Tomas. Flier is a global diversity and inclusion lead at Google. His role and purpose are to build a more equitable company and world by empowering underrepresented communities and historically marginalized groups. He's been granted the Young Hispanic Corporate Achievers Award by the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility and currently serves as a One Young World Global Ambassador. Welcome, Kristin and Tomas. How are you guys doing this afternoon or this morning, depending on your time zone?
Doing great over here in the United States. How about yourself?
Doing great. It's great to be here. Grateful to be here. Thank you.
Well, this is fabulous. I'm doing well as well. So let's get it started. So as Sephora has said, last year, we've all experienced many challenges, many opportunities to connect, and many opportunities to reflect on how we interact with one another. Considering the development of the racial justice movement during the pandemic, do you see an awakening in terms of our values in our societies? Kristin, can you respond to this question first?
Absolutely, and thank you, One Young World and CogX, for having myself and Tomas here today. What I would say to that is I don't believe that there is an awakening because racial justice has always been an issue, especially in the United States. What I think is most of value that has changed is more people are realizing the struggle and the fight that has been going on for racial justice throughout this entire time of humanity. And it's just been that those in power and those in the majority of societies have come to realize that. And sadly, at the cost of a lot of people's lives. So what I would say is I want to think of it as an awakening, but a realization of how our societies work is how I would go about that.
Okay, thank you. And Tomas, what is your experience and your perspective of this?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having us here, for having me here, CogX, One Young World, and you, Aminka. I completely agree with Kristin. I think we can only talk about awakening if we are talking about some part of the society, right? Reason I'm saying that is the same as Kristin, right? Like, yes, in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, many people discovered, oh, we have racism in our society. But people of color and folks who have been paying attention, actually, we have been seeing that racism is present and is systemic, meaning that it's embedded from our subconscious to all of our institutions. So the only difference now is that it is in mainstream media, right? So the good thing, though, is that now these conversations are a must here in public and private spaces as well. And another great thing is that there has been a realization that racism is present not only in the US. There's been this narrative over and over, but actually anti-Blackness is global, right? And it is as present or even more present in societies that are less integrated or have less diversity. And to your point, Aminka, to your question, I do think it is good also for our values on our society in general, because building the muscle to talk about racism helps us to recognize it more. And the more we start seeing these power dynamics and how they operate, then we can start paying attention and recognize how other systems of oppression show up. For example, how I, as a man, tend to take more space or talk over other genders. So I do think it is good for our society in general.
That's really great. Thank you for both for sharing that. And also you, especially Tomas, for saying anti-Blackness, because this is something that is forgotten or not included when we discuss racial justice and inequality, that we don't understand that there really is system in place to really disvalue and to take away the dignity of Black people from many races. As you said, Black people are all over the world, and unfortunately we got all over the world through the transatlantic slave trade, and this has continued. So one thing that there's a conversation about diversity inclusion, why last year was an awakening, is because we were all at home. We were all at home and we were seeing the inequality of COVID-19 drastically affecting people of color, more so than non-people of color, the wealth inequality. And for us, it kind of was a boiling point where it was like, it's no longer we can just be nice and we're not racist. We have to actively dismantle these systems in our society. And this now has come in the D&I work, people like to say, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But some people get it wrong all the time. They have challenges to understand the terminology and to implement it. So Tomas, why does it seem so hard to get diversity and inclusion work right? And what are the biggest challenges to the work?
Yeah, so the challenges are so many, and you are right, this is hard work. And if we are taking this work seriously, it is not if we are going to step on it, but when we are going to step on it. Mm-hmm. Because we are trying to solve something that society hasn't solved yet. As Dr. Belvitt said, this is not a technical challenge where problems and solutions and the possible solutions are clear, but this is an adaptive challenge, meaning that the problem and the solution requires learning and personal transformation to even see them. There are no clear solutions, there is no roadmap. But as I was talking before, it's a muscle, right? And we need to intentionally train it to recognize microaggressions, micro inequities, especially when you are in the privileged end. For example, as a white passing man myself, it is hard for me to understand how I benefit from my white adjacency. Because as Dr. Peggy McIntosh said, I was trained to remain oblivious to it. And privilege is invisible to privileged people, right? And one other reason that is hard and complex is because it is extremely uncomfortable and hard to talk about privilege. My natural reaction is, oh, you mean, Aminka, that I don't deserve what I got? I've been working my ass off on this. Mm-hmm. And actually, yes, Tomas, you earned it. And if you were a woman of color, you would have had to work 10 times harder to get where you get. And we are all part of this system of oppression, right? Like, it forces us to talk about privilege. It's a relational dynamic. Advantage comes at the expense of someone else. For example, in the US, I get an extra 19 cents of every dollar I earn because a white woman is losing it. And I cannot give it back. It's an auto deposit. What we can do, though, is to learn how to use that advantage, that privilege, to dismantle these systems. Use my privilege as power to visibilize and amplify the voices from the margins.
That's true. Thank you for sharing that. And Kristin as well, too. Share us definitely why you find D&I work so hard, but also too, how do we incorporate as well, yourself being Olympic champion, disability as well, because sometimes myself being a visible Black woman, people look at D&I work as just, okay, let's get all the Black people in as we can, or let's get the queer community in, and not understanding the intersectionalities of abilities within diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Absolutely. To your point and to Tomas's point, I think the hard thing for all of us is how do you incorporate intersectionality in D&I work, and particularly if you belong in a minority group. Yes, I'm a person with a physical disability. I'm a woman and I'm white, but largely in the disability space world, particularly in the United States, a lot of leaders in the disability community are white. We need to have more representation of persons of different colors and different skins to really reflect the demographics, especially in the United States. We're going to get it wrong, and we need to keep getting it wrong until we get it right, and that's going to take a few tries. I know in innovation we talk about build, measure, learn. We need to do that inside D&I. And know that as long as we keep trying with our intentions on how to be inclusive, we're going to get there. But just thinking about the Oscars this year, we had Crip Camp finally nominated for Best Documentary. And it's some incredible people inside the disability rights community. It was the first time the Oscars finally had a ramp. Mind you, we've had plenty of actors win Oscars for playing a disabled person when there's clearly enough talent to employ disabled actors in those roles, right? So how, in my perspective, how are we in our mainstream media portraying and employing people for the dominant narratives that we see in our mainstream media of these minority experiences, particularly disability? Is it always going to be, I'm so disabled, I'm waiting to be cured, and my life isn't as worthy because I'm disabled? That shouldn't be, because it's not authentic. So we need those authentic stories, not just in our film, but we need them also in our magazines. We need to see them on the news. We need to see that it's all entirely intersectional, and disability spans all minority groups.
Well, coming off what you were saying, to ensure that we recognize all abilities in the different areas of our society, how can sectors equitably harness the power of disabilities, the disabled or abilities community? I like the term able inclusive. How can we allow spaces to be more able inclusive? Any specifics that you may have for an X industry, and they want to know, like how they always say when, for instance, last year, they wanted to know how can we treat Black people better? And they brought in individuals who do an eye and try to bring, well, don't touch Black women's hair. Like, very simple things, but we still don't get. But what are some specific things that organization could be more able and inclusive or more accessible to individuals who have physical or non-physical disabilities? Kristin, you
Exactly. Yeah, I think I'm very grateful to be working inside the U.S. federal government. So there's a lot of standards that, as a federal employee, the federal government has to have. But if you think of other entities inside the public sector, if we're thinking of NGOs, if we're thinking of even the private sector, we have to change our standards in our policies of how are we including and employing persons with disabilities? Are you making it harder to give someone an accommodation that they actually need, that they went through all the paperwork, and you're still thinking that their productivity is going to go down if they ask for more days to telework? We just had a pandemic, and we're still going through a pandemic that shows that if your work allows with the type of work, if you can do it from home, you can still be as productive as you are in the office. So why did we have those standards before the pandemic? That is certainly something that I hope we continue to take forward after COVID, especially for persons with disabilities. The other thing, as a disabled person, you do not have to disclose your disability in the interview process. In the United States, that's actually illegal to do for employment. So I am not well versed in what those standards would be internationally, depending on each country. But you don't have to disclose that. You, as a disabled person, you bring talent to the table. Being disabled is not your whole entire identity. And you also do not need to be the sole person to talk about accessibility. Just like we should not solely be asking Black people issues about race. They bring a lot more to the table than solely that. So those are a few things that I would say to that question.
Great, thank you for sharing. And Tomas, what are you guys doing at Google? Or what are some of the things that you recommend that companies can adopt to make their workplaces more accessible and equitable to the disability inclusive community?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to echo this last part that Kristin said, that actually when we are bringing diversity, when we are bringing people with disabilities, it is making the workplace greater, not in spite, but because you're bringing unique perspectives. And so I love the point that you made, Kristin. And I can talk how we're thinking about this at Google. We talk about product inclusion, which is this idea of if we want to build for everyone, we need to build it with everyone. And having everyone throughout the product development process, like from the ideation of what do we want to do to UX research, marketing, launch. And that makes total sense. If I want to create better products, I don't know, for Brazilians, for instance, it makes sense that having Brazilians throughout the product development process. And if Google, for example, says that we said that one of our slogans is built for everyone, well, then we believe we need to do it with everyone. And that includes the disability community, especially tech companies that have the power to give access to people and connect folks. We have a responsibility towards society. But even if companies, for instance, didn't actively think about building products and solutions for the disability community, that company would be missing a huge financial opportunity as well. When you look at the fact that there are over 1 billion people with disabilities and they represent a market of more than $1 trillion, then those companies would think that again. And also there's this concept that when we design with inclusion in mind, when we include disability in the design process, more people benefit, everybody benefits. That's why we call it universal design, right? We end up making our products better for all. This is a well-known curb cut effect, that the curb cut in the sidewalk was created for people in wheelchair, but then elderly people, skateboarders, bicycle, like everybody use it. Or it's the same as closed captioning on YouTube. I know that it was created for the hearing impaired community, but English is not my first language, and I am not part of the disability community, and I use closed caption all the time to better understand the videos. And at the end of the day, what we are talking about is social justice, fairness. So if 1 billion people are not included, we would be complicit and contributing to these huge inequities if we don't do something about it.
Yes, I really like that. And while you guys were both responding and sharing, having individuals included in the conversation in the workplace that have different abilities, it creates better outcomes. And also too, it changes your framework. Remember, when I was in university, I was a part of the board of directors for my student federation. And one of the committees I was on was the disability community. So our role was to find different student organizations and events so they could access this disability fund to make their event more inclusive. And a lot of the organizations like student federation groups were unaware that this fund exists. And randomly, I don't even know how I end up on the committee, but the point is me being on the committee and seeing the lack of even thought what people would have. So for instance, now with virtual conferencing, I've never seen so many interpreters on a TV screen as I have during COVID-19. And it brings you to the question, where were they before? Where was the thought before? And being a part of that community made me go into that thinking, okay, I'm organizing an event. Do I have, at the time the school was bilingual, I need to have English and French interpreters, but do I have American Sign Language interpreters? And then I have to have the French interpreters. Is this space accessible to somebody using a wheelchair, a walker, also too, if somebody is a parent? So it took me to be a part of that committee to have that thinking about how inclusive is my event, how diverse is my event. And it even goes further when I think we're very comfortable thinking culturally, because you think to yourself, if my event's inclusive, am I having alcohol? What about those who don't drink? What about pork and things like that for those who are halal? And I think the more that we get into the cultural thinking, how inclusive is this event? Who cannot attend this event? Who is being physically not banned, but being having more barriers to have access to this event, and how can we make it more inclusive? And I think, like you said, having that thinking that we always just think, okay, well, this event's not for disabled people, so we wouldn't think that. But no, disabled people, they like music, they like this, they care about causes, and how can we think that we make events that they can participate? So I really like that, not looking at people as their disability or their ethnicity, but looking at their interests and just more so how they can have accessibility to experience their workplace or the content that we're giving them. So with also to the disability community and also to with education, technology has really changed the landscape of our lives. Some can say for the better. Myself being in technology, I think so too. Maybe Tomas can agree. But Tomas, considering the speed of technological change, you talked about what you guys are doing at Google, especially that happened in the pandemic, us being on virtual call, this conference being virtually. If and any, what are the consequences do you see currently and exiting this pandemic in relations to D&I and inclusiveness?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of consequences. And also there are some countries that, yes, we are exiting, like here in the US, this pandemic, it feels that way. And there are other countries that are in the middle of the second, third waves as well. And as we discussed, yes, one silver lining of this horrible pandemic has been the racial reckoning on some parts of the society, and that now diversity is a must. But you're right, Aminka, in most of aspects, this pandemic has actually enlarged the existing gaps that exist and inequities that exist in our societies. All businesses, for example, have been forced to go online, and not all were ready for it. The digital divide only grew, especially in marginalized communities. For example, when you see that the majority of Latin America's classrooms remain closed and almost half the homes don't have Wi-Fi, the consequences are terrible. And we are going to see in the years to come all of the consequences of this. I saw recent McKinsey research too, that, for example, US Latinos started this semester, up to 5 months behind in math. And that makes sense when you see the fact that 40% of Hispanic homes in the US had no computer or broadband access. But not only things as obvious as access to technology, but inequities also have accelerated in this context. Domestic violence against women is another example. For instance, in Argentina, the number of women killed reached a 10-year high during the pandemic. And that's why we all need to work together on leveraging our companies, our circles, our organizations to channel resources to close that digital divide and inequities. I am proud to share that Google is stepping up with some projects and realizing the responsibility in the face of the disaster. I invite you all to go to g.co/COVID-19 relief and see the multiple initiatives that include more than $100 million in COVID relief efforts. But this is not a nice to have. Big corporations must do something about it as well. They are part of our society and they have a huge responsibility.
And Kristin, what are some of the challenges that you see with the technological advances, especially during the pandemic?
Tomas, I completely agree with you. I think one thing, particularly in the United States, that we can do a better job is access to internet and broadband, particularly in our tribal areas for Native Americans, and also in marginalized communities. The other thing that I would add is having access to healthcare in our digital space. As we can see, healthcare, I personally believe healthcare is a human right. And that is something that we still need to work on and strive for here in the United States. It shouldn't be how much money you have to get the correct assistance that you need to get healthcare. So I personally believe if we improve our digital access, we can also improve our healthcare access in the United States.
That's true. That is really great. So we just have a few more questions just before we go to the ones that have been prepared for the audience. So Kristin, what direction do we collectively take next to champion DEI in the redesigned hybrid workplace? Or perhaps you want to rename DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I hope there's a day that we no longer have to use D, E, and I, and that's just a norm. I hope that it's not a secular form of work, and hope it can morph into what is the normal. Going off of that, I think that for a better hybrid workplace is not just if you need to work from home more often, but I think all employees, they should push forward that it improves your space and your productivity and also your work culture for having that opportunity to work from home. Certainly persons with disabilities, it's been absolutely huge to be able to do that. But once we do that, we need to improve access again to transportation, to getting into the office, physical design, and also with this space of using technology so much in the pandemic, how are we using our language to be more inclusive? And that doesn't have to be always bringing things up to your boss or making this huge cultural change. But how are you yourself using that language? And you do not have to have a disabled person in the room to say, you know what you just said was ableist. What you said just was not okay. And here's the reasons why. You do not need to be disabled to make a change to be more inclusive in society. In that way, you can be an ally, and that's what we need. So those are the things that I would say going forward that we can bring from the pandemic into this new hybrid space.
That's great. And Thomas, and what about you? How do you think we can champion D&I in the workplace moving forward?
Yeah, that's also a big question and an important one to address and be very intentional about it. Just echoing what Kristin said, I love that idea of not having DEI, not needing DEI in the future. As DEI practitioners, we always say that our job is not to need my job anymore in the future. And to your question, Aminka, there's no coming back to the old ways of 100% of people at the office. And you are right also that there can be growing inequities with this if we don't pay attention and we are very intentional about it. One example of this is having the possibility of working remotely, yes, can help companies recruit a more diverse workforce, people who, for instance, do not want to leave their communities and goes to less diverse areas, like Silicon Valley, for example. But this can create and accelerate existing inequities as well. For example, through distance bias, right? Because if you end up having a majority of underrepresented employees working remotely and employees from majority groups in person, this latter group can be closer to executives, creating more opportunities to bond, getting better projects and progressing faster. But even in the virtual world, research has shown that women and people of color have not had equitable access to key decision makers in this virtual space, nor they have had opportunities for visibility and advancement. So we need to be extremely careful and intentional about this. Today, more than ever, companies will need to uphold fairness and transparency in all of their processes, from distributing work, evaluating performance, and many other key leverage points. And another key top of mind thing that we need to discuss is mental health, not only for all employees, but especially for underrepresented communities that have been overly affected by COVID-19. For example, in the US, has overly impacted the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So we need to pay close attention at this, invest more and further in mental health. I love the other day, I read this article that was talking about organizational burnout that is happening. Mm-hmm. And if we heighten the pressure on already stressed employees of fix themselves, take vacation, meditate their way out of their burnout, it only perpetuates the cycle. It adds more stress. Now organizations need to intervene, reducing employee workload, ensure employees have sufficient resources to do their job virtually as well, role model work boundaries, etc. But to finalize, there are many DEI implications of remote work. That's why it is important, the concept of nothing about us without us model. Lean on your employee resource groups to make this return to office decisions, because they can provide input about unique implications for specific employee groups.
Okay, fabulous. So I have one last question for us to ask before we go to the questions from the audience. So this one, just to give like a rapid fire response with everything that happened during the pandemic, and we're still in the pandemic. What is one thing, you can say one thing that you're grateful for, or one thing that we adjusted to as a culture and a people that you would like to keep exiting the pandemic? So either one can go first. Kristin, if you want to answer it first.
Sure. On a personal note, the one thing I'm grateful for is my family and the people in my life. The pandemic has showed what truly matters to me are the relationships that I have.
Fabulous. Tomas?
Yes, 100%. And also, I think we all have more awareness and more clear realization that through work alone, you won't be happy. How we all need to develop the different facets of ourselves, our intellectual, artistic, collective, and spiritual aspects as well. It was very, very clear that just working is not going to make it.
I like that. I really like how you put that, Tomas, because I felt the same thing about the pandemic. And I think maybe because of your background and where you're from, I realized that in North America, we definitely put too much emphasis on our work and our identity. And a lot of us had to really do some soul searching and find out who we are, what we enjoy. And I believe that's the place where we find solutions. If we are more focused on how can we enjoy life better, we will want to create solutions to our problems, because we will realize we need to do something about the environment. This pollution is terrible. We really need to make sure women have and parents have proper childcare and proper education, because when some parents had to teach their kids, they went crazy. So I think a lot of the things that we didn't like in the pandemic, it again was just amplifying. We need to do better to find these solutions. So Kristin, I have a specific question for you that I would like you to answer that came from the audience. Conversation around these matters can sometimes become sensitive. People become in their feelings, as we like to say, and people can become defensive. What are practical tools and approaches people can use to open what can be difficult conversations in the workplace?
That's a great question. So thank you for asking that. I think the best way to go about that is to, if you're having that conversation and before you bring this up to your boss, or if this is with your boss, or if this is with HR, just because you understand does not mean that you agree. So I think using a space of empathy and saying to that other person, I understand where you're coming from, I think helps bring that defensiveness down. I understand where you're coming from. I understand that was not your intention, but this is how it came off. And this is why that was hurtful. This is why I found that very offensive, because of my lived experience of XYZ. That is how I would try and start of saying, from a place of understanding. So you bring down that space of fear, of getting defensive, of, oh my God, I am not that person that says those things to make it come off that way. So thank you for asking that, and I hope that helps.
That's great. I think that's fabulous. Is being able to recognize where people might have those experiences from, why it might be difficult, but also to grow in with them and saying, okay, like, let's learn together, and here's an opportunity to grow, right? And I think that goes perfectly into our next question. When people become sensitive about the experiences, they just want to end the conversation and cancel people. So what about cancel culture? How can we address the deliberate undermining of the push for diversity and inclusion, which the pushback phraseology of cancel culture? Tomas?
Yeah, and I love it. We are starting to have this hard conversation. Like, thank you for the question. First, as we were discussing, why we need to talk about diversity and inclusion. These systems in society have been serving some communities over others. Corporate America, for instance, was created by men for men. So we need to do something about it to include. Or many people say, oh, in the past we could say, it was okay to say this. It was okay to say that. It was okay for who, right? And also, I want to address this idea of, oh, diversity and inclusion is politically correctness. Actually, I think it is the opposite. It is, let's have this hard conversation. It is the opposite of political correctness. Do not take race and gender, for example, out of the table. Let's talk about it. But it is true that we do need to enter this conversation, as Kristin said, well, with vulnerability, humility, because we don't know what we don't know, right? And this idea of cancel culture, yes, like we don't need to cancel other folks, but we don't need to call out folks, but we need to call into their conversation, create place to talk about that. But it is true that if you are going to enter this conversation, if somebody is sharing a feedback on how you're making them feel, you need to have the humility, the vulnerability. Again, we don't know what we don't know. And shifting from the golden rule of I want to be treated as, I'm going to treat you as I want to be treated, to the platinum rule, as we need to treat people as they want to be treated. And to finalize, this is not a pie that we are fighting for resources. We need to move to an abundance mentality, not a scarcity. As we discuss over and over, the more we include, the more we integrate, it's better for all. So the pie actually gets bigger.
That's amazing. Thank you, everyone. That's all of our questions for today. I think it's really important that we continue these conversations. We continue to implement new and inclusive policies within our workplace. Kristin and Tomas, thank you. Do you have any final words that you'd like to share with those participating on the call today before we exit this panel?
I would just like to say thank you so much for having us on and having us start to have this hard conversation that is so important, and the work will continue on. Thank you.
Tomas?
Yeah, thank you so much, Aminka, Kristin. It's an honor to be having this discussion with you, and I invite everyone to join this conversation, this fight against systemic inequities, because ultimately it's about belonging, right? And belonging, as Professor John A. Powell says, is one of the primary human needs, and everybody felt othered at some point. So if we hear that society structurally it's othering some groups, then we all need to feel compelled to do something about it.
Fabulous. Thank you guys all today, and thank you, Young One World, for having me moderate this. It's been an honor.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you for the past 40 minutes. I've taken away so many key things. First, these conversations are now a must. We can't trade this off. This has to be here to stay. And as Tomas said, building a muscle to talk about racism and inequity also allows us to better recognize the other systems of oppression that other people face. And this work is really hard. As was also mentioned, it's not a technical challenge, it's an adaptive one. And as Kristin said, we're going to keep getting it wrong before we get it right, but we need to understand how we can build, measure, and learn within the D&I space. But we also then need to get to a place where D&I doesn't really have to exist as its own thing. In the same way, sustainability can't sit in a silo disconnected from the rest of a company's operations. It needs to be holistically implemented across an entire company's value chain. But for anyone who is approaching these conversations, as was mentioned, approach them with empathy, humility, and vulnerability. So I think we could have gone on for another hour, but we're going to now be taking a short break. Thank you, Aminka, for the wonderful moderating.